So I'm going to formally introduce Dr. Piquel. I just want to start out by saying we've really implemented the 40 developmental assets in a lot of communities here and in the larger community. In the past two conferences, we've had presentations on the 40 developmental assets and how to implement that in a school. Today we're really fortunate because we have the brand new CEO of Search Institute here with us to tell us himself about all that's going on and their new research. I'm going to read you his formal introduction. Kim Piquel is an educator and administrator who's worked at the school district, state, federal, and university levels. In 2012, he became president and CEO of Search Institute, a nonprofit research organization that partners with schools, programs, families, and communities to discover and disseminate what kids need to succeed. Much of his work prior to joining Search Institute focused on providing all young people in his home state of Minnesota with a world-class education and on closing the large achievement gaps that exist between Minnesota's low-income students of color and their more affluent Caucasian peers. From 2006 to 2012, he served as the founding executive director of the University of Minnesota's College Readiness Consortium. And from 2000 to 2005, he was executive director of research and development in the St. Paul Public Schools. From 1995 to 2000, he held several senior staff level positions in the Clinton administration, including White House Fellow assigned to the Director of Central Intelligence, Special Advisor to the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, and Special Assistant to the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Education. Prior to his time in Washington, he taught at the high school level in Minnesota and at the college level in China. He serves on the Board of Junior Achievement of the Upper Midwest. Dr. Piquel holds a BA in East Asian Studies from Yale University, a Master's in Education from Harvard, and a Doctorate in Education from the University of Minnesota. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Piquel.
Thank you so much. So good morning. The first thing I would say is call me Kent, number one. Second, I have never been in a place where people pronounce my last name as well as you do here in Georgetown, because it's P-E-K-E-L, and nobody says Piquel. And the story behind that is my grandparents were actually Peckle. And my dad grew up in small town in Wisconsin, large town in Wisconsin. And so my grandparents were Peckle, and then my dad was a minister, and when he first became a pastor, he ended up in New Jersey, in Jersey City. And everybody there, in particular African Americans, at least as he says it, pronounced it Pastor Piquel. And he liked that. But he never changed the pronunciation. And so everywhere I go, I'm shocked if anybody says Piquel instead of Peckle or Pickle or something like that. And I've been struggling with it, like, to try and find. I've tried to change the spelling and things like that, and I can never kind of figure it out. And so, in any event, it's great. It's more great to be here because the work that you all are doing here in Georgetown is absolutely, and surrounding communities. I heard about it shortly after I got to Search Institute a year ago, that you're one of the leading lights around the country of places that emphasize kids' strengths rather than dwelling on their deficits. And so I'm really thrilled to be here. Unfortunately, because of some goofy scheduling on our end, I need to run out of here as soon as I finish my presentation. And I apologize for that. Number one, it's rude. Number two, I'd really rather stay and hear the rest of the discussion and meet with you. I've already shared my card and my email address with one of you here. It's on the website at Search Institute. I'm interested in your ideas, want to try and answer your questions. And I apologize for needing to rip my computer out of the wall and try and get to the airport, but I've got something back in Minneapolis tonight. So in any event, what I'm going to try and do today is give you a sense mostly of what our new work is at Search Institute, and in ways that I hope are going to add value to what all of you do with kids every day. I'm going to inflict some charts and graphs and slides on you, but I hope that we have a good time, and I also hope that you won't hesitate to raise your hand with questions or comments or thoughts. So with that, let's jump in. Absolutely, please do not feel any need to give the right answer. How many of you have heard of the developmental assets before? So you can imagine you're different than a lot of places where I go around the country where people don't necessarily have an understanding of what the developmental assets are. Our mission at Search Institute remains the same one that it has been for 50 years, including the last 20 when we did the research and programs on developmental assets. And that's discovering what kids need to succeed. And I think the developmental assets and I've been talking with folks last night and this morning about this. They were powerful when they were created in the early 1990s, mostly because they just said, darn it, we're going to draw a line in the sand, and we're going to name these factors. First they had 30, then they argued a lot about it, and they added another 10. And some wanted to add another 10, and thank God somebody stopped them, because 40 is a lot. But they gave a language, and they gave a framework. And that since the creation of that framework, as all of you know, the work has gained momentum in a lot of ways. And part of my opportunity and challenge in being new at Search Institute is how do you build on what we've been and extend to what we need to be to meet the needs of people who are working with kids in settings like yours. So for Search Institute, we really have been thinking about the assets in these broad 8 categories. Many people who know all 40 of the developmental assets don't think about them in these 8 categories very often. And so that's why I like to just briefly flag this. And I also like to think of them, we've talked historically about external assets and internal assets. For people who don't know anything about assets and the language, in some ways a more plain language way to say it is these are supports and these are strengths. These are the supports in kids' lives that we know correlate with educational success and healthy development. These are the strengths in kids' lives. And you know that over the 2 decades that Search Institute has been doing this research, we have found repeatedly that the more assets kids have, the better they're going to do. They're more likely to thrive. They're more likely to avoid using drugs and alcohol and sexually promiscuous behavior and an array of other risk factors. And they're more likely to be resilient through trauma, through challenge. And very importantly, that finding has been found to be true across lines of income, race, and gender. More assets, the better. So that brings us to 2013. This is my wife. She's a middle school principal. And I know it's a little random to show a picture of your wife, but I like to do that. And she's in her. She would be furious if she knew I put that in there, because it was for the local paper. She was a principal in a pretty small town on the Minnesota-Iowa border at the time that they took this. And her name's Katie. And the reason I include this is when I was working at the University of Minnesota on college readiness last year, and they did a national search for the position at Search Institute, and I happened to be a local guy. And the search firm called me, and we were talking about it. And I said to Katie, well, you think I should think about applying for this job? And she said, well, yeah, I've always liked Search Institute. I've always really followed their work. I liked the strengths-based approach. They had done some things in the middle school where she worked. But she said something that stuck with me then and has really come back to me again and again since then. She said, I get that kids' lives are complex. I get that we can't reduce kids to a test score. And I get that there's probably at least 40 factors that matter in kids' lives. But I have 1,000 kids in this middle school. About 70% of them live in poverty. And we have a gigantic array of challenges. I can't do 40 assets. Give me 2. And she said that partly kind of flippantly. But there's an important tension there for Search Institute, which is to say, if thinking ecologically about kids' lives is important, it can leave you sort of like a deer in the headlights saying, OK, with the limited amount of time I've got with this kid, in my caseload, in the juvenile justice system, in my school, in my classroom, what do I do to get the ball moving in that direction? And so a lot of our work right now is trying to say, where do you start? Where do you begin working with kids to put them on a path to healthy education, youth development? It's not throwing out the other 39 assets. But it is kind of a useful question to ask, well, if you had to begin with one, where would you begin? We had a lot of fun last night with the video that I'm going to show you now, because as you'll see, the presenter who you're going to hear from for about 5 minutes, and the real reason is because there's some fun video of very young kids in this. So I thought it was a good way to start out the day. But he makes a pretty interesting suggestion about where we ought to start. If you can't do everything, where would you begin to try and build kids' capacity to add to their own assets? So let's kick ourselves off with this video.
I'm here because I have a very important message. I think we have found the most important factor for success. And it was found close to here, Stanford. Psychology professors took kids that were 4 years old and put them in a room all by themselves. And he would tell the child, 4-year-old kid, Johnny, I'm going to leave you here with the marshmallow for 15 minutes. If after I come back, this marshmallow is here, you will get another one. So you will have 2. To tell a 4-year-old kid to wait 15 minutes for something that they like is equivalent to tell us, we'll bring you coffee in 2 hours. Exactly correct. So, what happened when the professor left the room? As soon as the door closed, 2 out of 3 ate the marshmallow. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 40 seconds, 50 seconds, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes. Some lasted 14 and a half minutes. Couldn't do it. Could not wait. What's interesting is that 1 out of 3 would look at the marshmallow and go like this. Look at it, put it back. They would walk around. They would play with their skirts and pants. That child already at 4 understood the most important principle for success, which is the ability to delay gratification. Self-discipline, the most important factor for success. 15 years later, 14, 15 years later, follow-up story. What did they find? They went to look for these kids that were now 18 and 19, and they found that 100% of the children that had not eaten the marshmallow were successful. They had good grades, they were doing wonderful, they were happy, they had their plans, they had good relations with the teachers, students, they were doing fine. A great percentage of the kids that ate the marshmallow, they were in trouble. They did not make it to the university, they had bad grades, some of them dropped out, a few were still there with bad grades, a few had good grades. I had a question in my mind. Would Hispanic kids react the same way as the American kids? So I went to Colombia, and I reproduced the experiment, and it was very funny. I used 4, 5, and 6 years old kids. And let me show you what happened.
Hasta para un niño de 4 años, es atractiva la idea de tener el 5% de retorno a la inversión en 15 minutos. Sin embargo, algunos de ellos, tan pronto la puerta se cerró, se volvieron Otros, en cambio, resistieron el impulso.
So, what happened in Colombia? Hispanic kids, 2 out of 3 ate the marshmallow, 1 out of 3 did not. This little girl was interesting. She ate the inside of the marshmallow. In other words, she wanted us to think that she had not eaten it, so she would get 2, but she ate it. So we know she'll be successful, but we have to watch her. She should not go into banking, for example, or work in a cash register, but she will be successful. And this applies for everything, even in sales. The salesperson the customer says, I want that, and say, okay, here you are, the person ate the marshmallow. If the salesperson said, wait a second, let me ask you a few questions to see if this is a good choice, then you sell a lot more. So this has applications in all walks of life. I end with the Koreans did this. You know what is so good? We want a marshmallow book for children. And we did one for children, and now it's all over Korea. They're teaching these kids exactly this principle, and we need to learn that principle here in the States because we have a big debt. We're eating more marshmallows than we're producing. Thank you so much.
I can never resist the chance to see the little girl with the marshmallow actually again. Yeah, you can get the lights actually. Thank you very much. So if the goal here is to sort of understand in the complexity of the developmental assets and other facets of what matters in kids' lives, where do you start? If you had to pick a place to begin. His answer was delay of gratification, self-discipline. I think if I posed that question to each of you, you probably would come up with different answers to that question. Some might say motivation, some might say empathy, caring about others, some might say begin with a value statement, some might say self-efficacy, the belief that I can accomplish my goals. But the big takeaway, I think, and the jump-off point for the rest of our time together is there is a large body of what Search Institute has historically called internal assets, that economists call non-cognitive skills, that many psychologists call social psychological skills, that some other folks call social emotional skills, others 21st century learning skills, and maybe in most plain language statement, soft skills. The term that I've settled on after trying out different ones for a while is life skills. But these are those critical skills that we know matter tremendously in young people's lives that, frankly, you can't capture with a score on a standardized achievement test. So if the answer to where we begin positively trying to work with young people involves developing those really critical life skills, one way to do that is the way that Joaquin Posada, at the end of that video, mentioned. Did you notice that he said, literally, the Koreans looked at this famous experiment that a guy named Larry Mitchell did with marshmallows, and they decided, we have to teach that to everybody we want to book, and now we're teaching it all over Korea. I love the image of like Koreans teaching kids not to eat the marshmallow all over the place. And that is one valid way to work on these life skills, to do it through formal curricula, formal programs and opportunities. The point that I would make in response to that approach, though, and it's one that animates a lot of our work at Search Institute these days, is that very often those kinds of skills are probably better caught than taught. That in fact, sitting a kid down to tell them about perseverance and not to eat the marshmallow, you actually can, and they've done experiments with this, you can teach the kids distractors. You can teach the kid how to do mental visioning to not eat the marshmallow. You can teach the kid to do physical control exercises, and you can dramatically lengthen the amount of time before they actually eat the marshmallow. Still, most of them will eat the marshmallow to start at age 4, 5, or 6. So one approach to building these life skills is really to do it through formal curricula. And that's something that I don't mean to suggest is not a good way to think about those things. But you really are going to struggle to mandate that kids master these kinds of soft skills, these kind of life skills. Because ultimately, we know that the minute, it's just human psychology 101, the minute you mandate something, motivation plummets. None of us like to be told we have to do something, especially young children and adolescents. So creating a formal program to teach these critical life skills in a lot of ways is something that we would say is not a bad thing to do, but you also risk sucking the life out of the way that you actually can really help kids master these really critical internal assets. One of the other problems with that approach is that ultimately almost all of us in life have those moments when you are with a kid, or frankly an adult, and for some reason the floodgates open and it's the teachable moment. It's the moment when actually you can impress upon that young person the understanding of one of these critical skills that you could have spent hours, days, weeks, months, or years and never get through. I'm a Vikings fanatic, and unfortunately this year the team has not looked much like this, where last year Adrian Peterson did a lot of this. But it's a little bit like a running back seeing a hole in the line. That it's closed, but when the opportunity opens in that relationship to run through it, the impacts can be transformative in sometimes literally a very few minutes. A formal approach, a formal curriculum that attempts to get kids mastering these internal life skills in lockstep on a schedule is going to have a lot of trouble finding that moment when a hole opens in the line and you can run through it. And so the way that we're thinking about this increasingly is that these skills are built through relationships. And we're thinking of those relationships not just as nice relationships or good relationships, but as developmental relationships. They're the relationships between kids and adults and kids that are transformative, that help kids become who they are. And what I'm going to spend the rest of our time today talking about is how we're launching a new line of research to try and understand those developmental relationships, measure them, and then over time work with people like you to help build them with kids. And frankly, see what the consequences are. Do we see that when kids have developmental relationships with parents, with youth workers, with teachers, with counselors, with probation officers, does it have this really transformative effect? It's not an example from a kid, but I found a recent example of one of those. Well, let me before I go on to that, let me frame two ways that we're thinking about how you actually can help kids move to get through that line. At the macro level, there's an idea that I would highlight called a nudge. And at the micro level, developmental relationships. So I jumped to developmental relationships a little too quickly. For all of you who are working in programs and schools, thinking about a nudge is a really, really productive way to think about helping kids master those internal skills and dispositions. So what's a nudge? You all understand what the basic, regular meaning of the term nudge is. There's two behavioral scientists, one studies actually law and one studies economics, that have tried to distill the big literature right now that is out there on behavioral science into a simple concept of a nudge. And that concept goes back to the point I made a minute ago about how you can't mandate that people are going to do things and keep their motivation high, keep their investment high. And so the basic idea of a nudge, as Thaler and Sunstein have conceptualized it, and this is a book they wrote a couple of years ago about it, is that a nudge is neither mandating one course of action for the young person, but nor is it giving all options so that you have absolutely no choice. Instead, it's framing a limited number of options, so choice is preserved, making sure all of the options are good options, so there's no low road that you're explicitly opening, but then making the default option the best option, so that if the young person, or one of us, actually chooses a different option, they aren't choosing in the wrong direction. If they choose no option, they end up with the best option. Healthcare plans are, at least up until where we are right now with the healthcare changing, are increasingly using this in offering a menu of options to employees. You have 3 or 4 plans you can choose from. There's a default plan that they think usually works best for employees and then also, frankly, works well for the company or the organization that's sponsoring the plan. That's a nudge. Choice is preserved. The limited number of options are there, and they're all good options. And the default option is the best option. They found in interesting experiments that when they, for instance, in a school cafeteria, change the order in which the food items are presented to kids or the height at which the food is presented, in a single day, they can increase or decrease the amount of a given item that's consumed by 25%. That's a nudge. The point in nudge about not offering bad options might seem like obvious, like a blinding flash of the obvious. But the reality is, especially I would submit in education, which is where my career has been, for a very long time, we have officially endorsed bad options for kids. I can remember very, very, very recently working with schools, high schools in particular, where you'd look at their mathematics track, and in one I'm remembering vividly, there were 3 entire mathematics tracks: business math, English language learner math, and general math, none of which took kids to Algebra 1 over the entire course of their high school career. Those were officially sanctioned options that kids were allowed to choose from. After we did some work with that school, the principal said, cold turkey, the next year we're getting rid of those 3 options. And the kids that were in those 3 options are going to go into math that takes them at least to what in the 21st century we'd consider core proficiency. So that point about not keeping the bad option on the table is really, really critical. So let me give you a couple interesting examples of a nudge. And again, I'm raising nudge as something you can do at the organizational level. This is something that you could do in juvenile justice, in your schools, in your boys and girls clubs. And then we're going to get to developmental relationships. I apologize. I put developmental relationships ahead of nudge, and so we're just taking them in this order. So example of a famous nudge. This was from a psychology experiment that happened in the 1960s at Yale University. And what they did was they wanted to test the idea of, they didn't call it a nudge then, whether a very, very limited amount of additional information and urging, but no mandate, could change behavior. So what they did was they took a big group of the seniors, and they randomly sorted them into 2 groups. And they did it randomly so you couldn't have one group that had like all the motivated people and all the lazy people in the other, because they're all friends with each other. So they randomly put them into 2 groups. They got them all together in an auditorium, and they gave both groups an identical lecture on the evils and perils of tetanus, which was a big health scare at the time. Tetanus can make you really sick. The good news is there's a shot for it. And the call to action was go to the health service and get a free tetanus shot. That was all that they were asking them to do. So the first group just got that lecture and were urged to go to get a tetanus shot, and then they left. The second group got an identical lecture. But then in the space of 10 minutes after that lecture, they handed out a map of the campus. They asked the seniors to draw the path that they were going to take from their dorm to the health services, which was theoretically not needed because these were seniors. They'd been there for 4 years, and hopefully they could have found their way there. But they asked them to draw their path, and then they asked them to take out their planners and choose the day and the time that they actually were going to go get the shot. Before the days of iPhones and smartphones, they literally had to write it down. In the first group, when they just got the lecture, 3% went and got the tetanus shot. In the second group, 28% went and got the tetanus shot. Now, 28% is not a majority, but it's almost a 10-fold increase with 10 additional minutes of information and no mandate. That's a nudge. So nudging kids in developing these life skills at that big picture is one strategy that I would urge you to think about, and that we're going to be making part of our work going forward. Just to reinforce the point, let me actually, and I hope this doesn't, offend is maybe not the right word. Let me give you another example of a pretty interesting nudge. Only about half of you in the room will know what this is. But this is 100% true. For the half of you that don't know what this is what you'd see if you went into a men's bathroom in a public facility. And how can I put this in an appropriate way? In the restroom management industry, this is totally true, a major, major problem is something called spillage. That's the term. I will say, having 2 13-year-old boys in our family, it's not just in major restroom facilities. But spillage is a major problem. 12 years ago in the Amsterdam airport, where for some reason the facilities manager has a PhD in economics. How he ended up there, I don't know. They decided to try a nudge to deal with the problem of spillage. So they first carefully measured the problem of spillage across the airport, which you can do chemically. And then the nudge that they applied was on a random sample of the urinals in the Amsterdam airport, they painted a fly. After they had done this for a limited period, they went and remeasured for spillage. Adding flies to the urinals in the Amsterdam airport reduced spillage by 80%. I think for number one, I mean, I don't know if it says something about human psychology or male psychology. Shows we all need a goal to aim for. So, but it's a nudge. you're not mandating the piece. So that first macro point of what you might do at the macro level to think about helping kids develop this is think about nudges. Think about giving a limited number of options to young people. None of the options are ones that you know are bad. And I mean, again, I've spent so many of my career, you know, a couple decades in schools, but I know this probably applies in your settings too. Don't keep offering the class with the ineffective teacher just because you can't figure out something for him or her to teach anymore. You're giving the kids a bad option. Easier said than done to deal with that. And then make the default choice a good choice. So that's sort of at the big picture level something that you might be thinking about. What do we do at the more one-to-one level, the granular level? And that's where our work that I got a little ahead of myself a moment ago is taking shape. And there we're focused on what we're conceptualizing as developmental relationships. Now, the idea that relationships matter in education and youth development is another blinding flash of the obvious in a lot of ways. I remember 15 years ago when we were working to change high schools up in Minnesota, and I actually was down in Texas, where I first heard the phrase, the new 3 R's, South Grand Prairie High School. Rigor, relevance, and relationships were going to be the new 3 R's of high school. And it was like I remember it to this day, hearing that from the principal and thinking, that's what we've got to be doing. And then we went back and we got a bunch of money from foundations and things. We did quite a bit with academic rigor. We raised the bar. We changed the curriculum. We did some with relevance. We had kids going to visit businesses and colleges, and every kid had to have a plan for after high school. But in retrospect, we mostly talked about the relationships. We had this sort of sense almost that relationships were something that either you were good at or not as a teacher or as a school. And I think what we've come to realize at Search Institute is that if we're going to build assets, if we're going to send more kids ready for some type of college and a career, if we're going to prevent kids from getting involved in the criminal justice system or support them once they're in there, we actually have to treat relationships with the same seriousness that we would treat the curriculum or the rigor. And that's what we're focused on in this new research on developmental relationships going forward. I think it's important, before I give you a sense of what we're learning about developmental relationships, to stress that these are not just good relationships, which is not to say that that's not critical. A lot of schools, and maybe some of your programs, have tried an exercise that actually can be really, really transformative for an organization, where you put all the kids' names on the wall or something, and then you have your staff go put a dot by all the young people that they know in some way. And you have to define that. Either you know their name on site, or you know their family, or you've worked with them on some criteria. But you give a criteria. And then you put the dots up, and almost invariably, you're shocked to see how many kids have no dot. And that's a big insight. That's a really important insight. But what we mean by developmental relationships is, even if you have a dot there, is what's happening in that connection developmental? Are you actually able to, through the ongoing interaction you have with the young person, help them develop those critical life skills like perseverance and delaying gratification? So that's what we mean when we're talking about developmental relationships. We're not alone among the research world that are trying to take relationships more seriously and begin to define them with greater rigor. There are some folks doing interesting works at Harvard who've talked about how they're seeing, like we are, that relationships are those critical, is the ground where those life skills grow. Again, as we've concluded, they're better caught than taught in a lot of ways. There's 2 researchers at the University of Pittsburgh who've gone so far as to suggest that the effectiveness of programs that serve young children, and they are particularly concerned with children who are, it's not my favorite term, but at risk, should be determined by whether they strengthen or weaken developmental relationships. They actually posit, and they've looked at things as different as orphanages around the world, to early childhood programs, to other youth social service agencies. And they've said the secret sauce between one program and another is whether they're forming developmental relationships with the kids. So what is a developmental relationship in more plain language? Like, what are we talking about here? I pulled this quote from a blogger that I follow on Twitter because he's got interesting opinions. But one day he wrote about his kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Martino, My kindergarten teacher was one of the most important and influential people in my life besides my parents. She was the one who noticed I was an awkward and insecure boy and made sure to remind me daily of how talented and beautiful I was. My success in life is directly related to the confidence this incredible woman instilled upon me during my most important years. Now, this guy is in his 30s, and he's thinking back to the transformative impact of his kindergarten teacher. That's the power that can happen in a developmental relationship. And if we had more time today, and this was more of a workshop than sort of a presentation, I would be actually asking you first to talk with each other and then to share with the group the people in your own life who were developmental. And I'll tell you, when I do that with a group, and this is very new work that we're unpacking here, so it's new for us and we're learning. It's often almost binary. Either people had them or they don't. I was in Chicago last week, and I was at a school that serves 19 to 22-year-old kids, most of whom have been dropout, and I was doing that longer session with the staff. And some of the people, I had to shut them up because the stories were so good and transformative. My uncle, the person on the block, a lot of stories of coaches, my father. And so we started to talk about, OK, unpack that. What was developmental for you in that relationship? And then there were other people who, and the people were being really honest because, first of all, it was a school community that's very committed to kids, and they knew each other. There were other people who just said, nobody did that for me. I did not have it. Now, I'm sure if I spent a lot of time with them and really probed that, we could think differently. But the room got pretty quiet because there were several points at which people said, and then one of the women asked the woman who really articulated it in such stark terms and said, well, what would have been different for you if you had had developmental relationships in your life? And she actually kind of teared up and said, everything. Now, OK, so what do we do with that insight? You know, can you like walk out of the room here and suddenly create a developmental relationship with kids? I would be impressed, but surprised if you could do that. And that's why we're launching this research, to try and understand what these relationships are, what their impact is, and how you form them. So what are we learning so far? And this is what I'm going to spend the rest of the time. We're doing that research in 3 ways. One, we're wonky looking at the data. We're looking at statistical correlations and what we see in surveys and other data sets to see, with people who have certain outcomes, are there certain things we can learn about the relationships that they had in their lives as young people. We're looking at the research literature and trying to see what else has been studied. There's actually a huge body of research in psychology and other fields that almost never makes it into education or youth development to apply to kids. So we're looking at that, but we're also out there talking to kids. We're doing focus groups, we're doing interviews, and people who work with kids, people like you, as well as parents. So that's where this is coming from. In 2014, we'll have a more formal framework that we can share with you and others, and then we'll be building surveys that are ways to actually study developmental relationships and start to measuring them. We hope 2 or 3 years from now, we can talk about developmental relationships in the way that Search Institute has talked about developmental assets for the last couple of decades. So here's a down payment on some of what we're learning. First of all, this is coming up again and again and again. That young person says, I feel seen. I feel seen as an individual. I'm not a cog in the machine. I am not a body in the desk. They know me for who I am. Again, last night at the dinner, we had the phrase came up, it's common sense but not common practice, which I hadn't quite heard before. It's common sense that feeling seen as an individual would be transformative. Many of the kids are saying, nobody sees me as an individual. And I know when you're talking to teenagers, you also have to have a grain of salt about exactly how they're describing it. But this is coming up, number one, again and again. They see me for who I am. The second is when we ask about these skills that they feel that they're developing or that we see in research, when we look at how young people seem to develop habits of motivation or empathy for others or problem solving, it's a dynamic blend of challenge and support. It's not one or the other. And I'll talk about that in a second. Number 3, these relationships are ones where the adult in particular helps the kid envision a future self, a possible self, and connect the possible self to who they are today. Now, when you're out there talking with a kid, you don't use language like I'm using, like, what is your possible self, you know, kid? But you're helping that young person and play it forward. See who they might become. And then the second piece of that is very, very critical, because it's not just dream big, it's connecting the dreams to the steps that those kids are taking every day. We know that today's teenagers in the United States are actually the most ambitious generation of teenagers in American history. They aspire to higher paying careers, jobs, post-secondary education than either their parents or their grandparents' generation. We also know that their understanding of how to attain those aspirations is worse than the previous two generations. So there's a famous book by two sociologists that's about 10 years old, but it's a really seminal study called The Ambitious Generation, America's Teenagers Motivated but Directionless. In the sense that kids today are dreaming big, they're not struggling to do that. American kids, one measure that they beat the pants off the rest of the world in study after study after study is self-esteem. They feel better, they will tell you they feel better about themselves than kids in any other country. So the challenge is not high aspirations, it's closing the gap between aspiration and action. And we're hearing in those developmental relationships there's a positive vision of where you can go, and there's a connection to what you need to be doing every day. There's emotional caring that is happening. It's that old saying about, I don't care what you know till I know that you care. And again, I think most of us who think that everybody who works with kids or has their own kids would be projecting emotional care. But I think a lot of you have a very clear sense of how rare that is in a number of young people's lives. So it's kind of a baseline. The fifth point that is coming out is it's mutual. There's something in it, not just for the kid. The kid is aware that the adult gets something in it too. There's the sense that Mr. Smith is learning from me. He learned something about my spark, my interest, learned something, or he enjoys interacting with me. And so there's a mutuality there that is also coming through. Again, differentiating a developmental relationship from what we might call a good relationship. And interestingly, we did a focus group a couple weeks ago, and of course I'm synthesizing these things in language that is not exactly what you get from middle and high school students, but there's some teachers who they're passionate about what they teach as opposed to me. And those are often teachers that are very respected, and they're very good at teaching. And the kids like them. But then when you say, did you learn these life skills from those teachers? Were you getting something beyond that? And often there's a departure there. There's the sense that, no, that person is good, they're professional, they're engaged, they're funny, they're doing those kinds of things. But are they getting something from me? Or could you replace me with any other kid, and they probably wouldn't miss me, is the mutuality piece that's coming out of it. Over time, in a developmental relationship, it seems that there's increasing autonomy, there's increasing youth voice. And sometimes this is just what you talk about, but it also can be mentoring relationships, what you do, what the mentor does with the kid. In an instructional relationship in a classroom, that it may begin with very teacher-directed, do this, do this, do this. But over time, it becomes the kid has more say. The kid has more control of what the relationship focuses on and how it feels. And where you don't have that happen, a relationship that is developmental at one point can stop being developmental. Because frankly, the kid is never getting to actually exercise more sway in how the relationship is occurring. So 6 factors that are coming up in this work thus far. And I'm just going to spend the rest of our time on 3 of those factors. We're going to focus briefly on what it means to feel seen, focus a bit on that idea of challenge and support as a duality, and then finally spend a bit more time on this idea of connecting your current self to your possible self. So that's our focus for most of the rest of the time that we've got here. So what do we mean when we talk about feeling seen as a young person? This is something that we know we need to define a lot more precisely. But when we did a major national survey, and this was of 15-year-olds, so put that developmentally in your head, that they're not 18, they're not 12. We said, we can't say, what does it mean to be seen? So the question we asked was, when an adult gets you, really understands you, what are the things that they do in your life? And when I looked at these things, and I thought about my own time, especially as a classroom teacher, you almost can turn this into a checklist and say, how often do I do this with the kids in my class? Or I think same could be for your caseload, for something else. Number one is they listen to me. Again, blinding flash of the obvious. How often are we making it clear that not only are we listening to the kid, but the kid is aware I'm listening to you? I mean, these are adolescents. It kind of takes a little beating on the head to make sure they understand it, that it's not just that you heard them and you therefore considered what they said and you moved on, but actually you made explicit the fact that I really heard what you said. So that was number one. Honesty was something that came up again and again and again. I will tell you that this is another one where a lot of these things that seem simple on a screen in a bar chart get very tough in practice. I remember in some work that we were doing when I was in Minnesota around college readiness. It was in a large urban high school that had a small self-contained program for American Indian students. They called it American Indian Academy. And it's a very high-need population in Minnesota. Many moved between reservations and the city, and there they were in the middle of the city. And we were talking about working with the kids on where they were academically. And the reality is these are high school kids, many of whom were not really academically even junior high students. And I'll never forget the discussion that a counselor and an administrator had about whether we ought to put on a form that we were calling a readiness rubric, which was a form that put all of where the kid was in terms of not just grades and test scores, but also effort, attendance, motivation. We were designing this form that we were going to use with the kid. And they had a passionate disagreement about how honest we should be with the kid about how far behind they were. And it wasn't because the counselor, and I remember I'm still in touch with her, Jackie Moscone. It wasn't that she wanted to lie to the kid, but she had the deep sense that if I tell them how far behind they are, they will give up. If I actually give them the truth, they're going to lose hope, and they're not going to be willing. And the administrator, who was a principal at the time, was saying, if we don't tell them, who will? And they're going to go through this high school, and they're going to progress further, and they're not going to realize that essentially, in terms of credits, they are still freshmen when they're juniors. And so where she landed was we got to give them the truth with hope, the brutal facts with an understanding that we can change these conditions. But kids are telling us honesty. Give it to me. Tell me like it is. Because when down the road I discover that actually what you told me isn't true, there's a real challenge to recovery. Showing up and being dependable. This is an interesting one that we're hearing about a lot. Even when you're having a discussion with a kid that goes really, really well, where the relationship starts to become developmental is if a month or two or a week or a day or even longer later, you remember what was talked about. Suddenly, the kid starts to say, oh my gosh, they really saw me. They're taking me seriously. They actually remember. Now, this is not a simple thing to do if you have 180 kids in your load as a teacher or many more. I mean, the average student-to-counselor ratio in Minnesota is actually 680 or something. It's the second worst in the country. Or your probation officer caseload. But finding ways to remember what the kid said from one point to the other. Laughing at their jokes. Interestingly, I'm sure your eyes all went to that already, 38% say, when an adult gets me, they give me privileges. There's a pretty clear honesty. And this is a large nationally representative sample, socioeconomically, and across the whole country. So this isn't just like 30 kids in Minnesota who said this. So that's some sense of what we think it means when we talk about kids feeling seen. Let me turn now to this next idea of challenge and support. Those two ways of seeing how kids develop these skills are obviously pretty familiar. But I think there's a lot of environments in which we do a heck of a lot more of one than the other, but not a balance of both. There's sort of the environment for kids in which it's like, no excuses, up by your bootstraps, you're just going to have to deal with this and do it. In Minnesota, until last year, we had a high school graduation test that you didn't get a diploma if you didn't pass. There was no waiver. There was no alternative pathway. It was make it or not make it. And for those kids that were struggling with that test, it felt like all challenge, no support in many schools. The counter, though, is also true. There's a lot of environments, and I've seen this in particular in programs that work with very young kids, in which it's, frankly, we love them to death, and we're nurturing them, and we're encouraging them, but we're not really challenging them to go beyond where they are. So in a theoretical world, you want the mix of challenge and support to look kind of like this, where as you're pushing the kid to go beyond where they are and where they've been, you're also supporting them every step of the way. This is not, using the graph is probably kind of a stupid idea. It's not a mathematical formula. But it, for me, captures that idea that where we want kids to be is in that trajectory where they're feeling supported even as they're being challenged. An example that I think captures this idea really well, that's one that all of us at some point actually went through as people, is an infant or a toddler taking their first steps. It's a really amazing crystallization of both challenge and support. On one hand, that kid is being literally called to do something they have no idea how to do. Their little brain physically doesn't exactly know how to control those legs. They have every reason to be afraid of being injured, in a sense. But they're being encouraged to take that step, to literally step into the unknown. But if we could see the face of that guy who's asking this kid to take that step, I think all of us can imagine probably what that face looks like, what the language coming out of that mouth is like. It's saying, you need to do this, you can do this, and I literally am here for you every step of the way, and I'll catch you if you fall. And it may seem a little unrealistic, but I think a lot of us who've worked with some 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds who seem to be pretty angry on the outside, that they're looking for something in a lot of ways that doesn't look entirely different than this. Now, we were saying last night, I would encourage you to walk into, the probation hearing or to your, counseling session or whatever and say, I'm here to help you take your first steps. But the metaphor, in some ways, kinds of applies. So, first one, kid felt seen. Second one, it's a mix of challenge and support. And then the third idea I want to spend a little bit of time on and then throw it open to some questions and observations is this idea of connecting your current self to your possible self. If we don't help kids understand that who I am today is who I'm going to become tomorrow, almost all the things we're trying to do to get them to act differently today are very unlikely to succeed or to succeed as well as they could. And in part, this is because of a basic fact of human nature. There's a large body of scientific research that shows that people are wired to project the present as static. People assume the current situation that I'm in, I've arrived, and this is how things are going to be. When in fact, we know in reality, life brings really dramatic changes. There was an experiment that some people, some psychologists did a couple years ago where they used music to try and capture this fact that it's pretty human tendency for people to think, to underestimate change and not plan for change. And here's what they did. They asked people randomly, in again, a carefully controlled study, think about who your favorite musical performer was 10 years ago. So they gave them a few prompts to remember who was president then and who your musical performer. They said, how much would you pay in today's dollars to see that act perform this week? How much would you pay? So whoever, if you think about who your own favorite was 10 years ago, how much would you pay for them to perform next week? Then they asked separately, OK, who's your favorite performer now? Who's your favorite musician now? how much would you pay to see them perform in 10 years? So you're going to pay me now, and then you'll see them in 10 years. When they asked people how much they would pay to see their favorite 10 years ago, the average answer was $80. When they asked people to say, how much would you pay to see your favorite today in 10 years, the average answer was $129. People knew that my favorite choice from 10 years ago probably has lost some luster. Like the songs aren't going to be as current, the notes maybe don't hit as well. But when they were asked to project what they like today into the future, they actually assumed it'll be just about as good as it will be in the future. And it was when the New York Times wrote about that story, if I can remember the quote, they had a line that I remember, something like, while people understood why favorites like the Dixie Chicks or I can't remember their other example may have lost their luster, they apparently expect Rihanna and Coldplay to blaze on forever. So it's the human condition to project stasis. But when we allow ourselves to do that mentally, it's very, very tough to change what we do in the present. This is a quote from Joseph Butler in 1736, who was a British theologian and philosopher. And it's kind of dense, but I think it makes a really powerful point. If the self or person of today and that of tomorrow are not the same, but only like persons, the person of today is really no more interested in what will befall the person of tomorrow than what will befall any other person. If you, especially as a kid, don't see your future self as a living, breathing version of you, but as an abstract idea, as some theoretical thing, especially, of course, if you're living in an environment where you actually doubt you'll live that long, literally. But even if that's not your concern, if you fundamentally don't believe that I will be that person in the future, telling a person, especially a kid, to work harder, to do better in the future, to save money, to avoid drugs and alcohol, is actually like urging them to give something away to someone else. Taking something that is valuable to me and not doing it to benefit somebody that I don't have a direct connection with, that I don't have a mental understanding of, is actually like saying, give it to your neighbor. Well, why would I do that? That person is not me. It's a bit of a mental trick, but there's a lot of research that suggests that not only is this the way a lot of people think, but the good news is it's actually something that when we mentally flip this switch, we can change behavior in the present. When we create a connection between possible self and current self, which again we're finding is a feature of developmental relationships, some pretty exciting things can happen. So before I give you a sense of the exciting things that are possible when we connect the current self to the future self, I'm going to actually play what I think is a really interesting example of what happens when that doesn't take place. It's a story, and I'm going to play an interview from National Public Radio. Some of you may have heard it. It's a story of a guy who actually was involved with drugs and alcohol in his 20s and robbing banks, and who went through a really extraordinary transformation while he was in federal prison. And there's some very important things in this interview where he clearly illustrates the fact that because his current self, as a young man, was very disconnected from what could have been his possible self, the destructive behavior in the present seemed to make all the sense in the world. It's an interesting interview because they bring the judge who sentenced him together with the guy who is now out of prison and actually in law school because he did some pretty amazing things while he was in prison. So I'm going to play this if it works for you. And I'm going to stop it. It gets a little bit long, but I'm going to start it actually from the beginning so you have all of the context.
Self-transformation. We brought together a convicted bank robber and a judge who sentenced him.
Good morning, Judge.
Good morning, Sean. It's been 15 years since we last talked or more.
I know. I was just thinking about that this morning.
Yeah, it's very odd, isn't it?
It's been 14 years, actually, since U.S. District Judge Richard Cuff sentenced Sean Hopwood to 12 years in federal prison for robbing banks in Nebraska. In prison, Hopwood started working in the law library. He found his passion and became an in-demand jailhouse lawyer. What's astounding is that Sean Hopwood was able to do something exceedingly rare. He persuaded the Supreme Court to hear a case based on a petition he pecked out on a prison typewriter for a fellow inmate. The chance of that happening for someone filing without an attorney, about 0.1%. And then he did it again. Long story short, after Sean Hopwood was released from prison, he was granted a full scholarship to the University of Washington School of Law in Seattle, and he's just snagged one of the country's most prized law clerkships. Next year, he'll clerk on what's considered the country's second most important court after the Supreme Court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Well, this outcome has prompted Judge Cuff to say this in a stunningly candid post on his blog: Hopwood proves that my sentencing instincts suck. Judge Cuff joined me from Lincoln, Nebraska, Sean Hopwood from Seattle, and our conversation starts with Hopwood. I asked him, why were you robbing banks?
Well, the first thing is I was a very stupid, foolish, and reckless kid. Well, I wasn't quite a kid. I was 21, 22 at the time, and I'd say the biggest thing was I really had no purpose in life. You throw in some desperation and some drug and alcohol addiction, and it was a recipe for disaster, and that's kind of what led me down the wrong path.
Well, Sean, you ultimately pleaded guilty, and Judge Cuff, when he appeared before you for sentencing, Sean told you he thought he could turn his life around, thought he could change. Do you remember what you told him at that sentencing back in 99?
I do. I think I said something roughly like, well, we'll see in about 13 years if you mean what you say.
And what were you thinking when you said that?
I thought this kid was a punk, and the chances of him doing what he said he was going to do were about as likely as nothing.
Well, Sean, you went off to federal prison. How were you able to master the law from prison and ultimately convince the Supreme Court to take your 2 cert petitions?
A lot of time and effort. I would spend literally days, months, years researching in legal books. For some reason, I had an aptitude for finding arguments. I don't know why that is. I had no prior history with the law other than breaking it. And you know, at the time when I started in the law library, I could not have named a right in the Bill of Rights. It took a lot of hard work, and I found that I really enjoyed helping my fellow inmates.
How did you hear, Sean, that the Supreme Court had taken your first cert petition?
I was walking out to the recreation yard one morning to go lift weights, and one of my friends came running and screaming out of the housing unit. And this kind of tells you about federal prison. The first thing I thought was, I must have said something wrong to him yesterday, and he's coming to fight. But you don't normally go to fight carrying a newspaper in your hand, and what he had was a copy of the USA Today, and it said that the court had granted John Feller's case, and how unlikely that was given that he had filed pro se without an attorney.
John Feller was your fellow inmate for whom you had written the petition.
Yeah.
Judge Cuff, did you have any idea at the time that the defendant who had appeared before you, whom you had sent to prison, had become a jailhouse lawyer, started having success?
I didn't learn about that until much later, and I was absolutely stunned. A lawyer who writes a cert petition and gets it granted, that's a career hallmark. An inmate to do that sort of thing is just unheard of.
Well, the two of you have been having a really fascinating exchange online on Judge Cuff's blog. And Judge Cuff, I wonder if you could read from your post after that memorable line that I quoted, Hopwood proves that my sentencing instincts suck.
Sure, I'd be happy to. When I sent him to prison, I would have bet the farm and all the animals that Hopwood would fail miserably as a productive citizen when he finally got out of prison. My gut told me that Hopwood was a punk, all mouth and very little else. My viscera was wrong.
Do you have that feeling very often, knowing that you have maybe been misguided, been wrong in the sentencing?
I do. I second guess myself all the time.
You do?
Oh, sure. I don't think that many judges would disagree with me about that. Picking a sentence and imposing it on another human being, no matter how it's rationalized, in a particular federal system where the goals of sentencing are very broad and conflicting at times, one can never be, or at least I've never been, certain that a sentence that I imposed is the correct one. I try to do my best, and that's about all I can do.
Sean, do you think Judge Cuff's viscera, that he was wrong in how he assessed you back in 1999 when you appeared before him?
No, I don't. I think people were surprised about the commentary back and forth between us and myself and the judge, but I don't know what people expect. It almost seems as if people expect me to say, hey, Judge, you know, I turned out to be a productive citizen, I'm a responsible husband and father, I'm a law school student, how about those apples? But why would I say that? I shouldn't back up what I said back in 1999, and the sentence the judge gave me was in accordance with the law at that time, and I had committed some pretty serious crimes, and I deserved to go to prison. So I have never been resentful or never thought that my sentence was unjust.
Judge Cuff, how does that strike you, what Sean just said?
Well, that's the kind of intellectual honesty that humbles me, that I was unable to see that Sean had the capacity for that when I sentenced him, reinforces, and here I'll disagree with him, my viscera was wrong. Sean's ability to be introspective and intellectually honest is the hallmark, I think, of rehabilitation. Whether he needed almost 13 years in prison to find that's an entirely different thing. And Sean and I talked about that. I think both he and I agree that if you were only interested in addressing the needs of most prisoners, a sentence of 5 years is plenty.
Let me just clarify here, Judge. You're saying that if the only goal is rehabilitation, if you're not thinking about punishment and what an appropriate punishment is for a crime, then you're saying 5 years should be the maximum.
Even if you're thinking about punishment for that individual, 5 years is plenty.
Sean, I know you've promised the judge whom you'll be clerking for next year, this is Judge Janice Rogers Brown, that you won't discuss your interview with her. So I'm not going to ask about that, but I am curious if you can tell us about your personal hopes for the clerkship and what it means to you.
Well, I think it represents to federal prisoners and former prisoners hope, because if I am given a second chance and allowed to have a job like that, maybe they can do it. And in fact, I went into the Washington prisons in July and talked to them and told them that I was going to have an interview with a federal judge about a clerkship, and the prisoners jumped up on their feet and started clapping.
Okay.
And for that reason alone, I am incredibly honored and excited to go clerk for Judge Brown.
Do you hear from prisoners who know about you?
Every day I receive emails, not only from prisoners, but parents of prisoners, especially parents whose their children are in their late teens and early 20s and have committed crimes and ended up in jail, and they're wondering whether their son or daughter can ever turn it around. To them, I represent a slice of hope.
Judge Cuff, any thoughts on that?
I think Sean said it perfectly. I don't want to try to gild that lily.
It is a remarkable story. You do wonder just how much of an anomaly this is. Does it give false hope to people who may not have the skills, the wherewithal, whatever it took for Sean to do what he's done?
Let me give you another example. I have a weed whacker at home. The weed whacker. The man at the weed whacker shop looked at it, told me what he needed to do, and said he would do it. And then said, "You're a judge, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You probably don't remember it, but you sentenced me." And he'd gone to prison for a federal drug offense, and he'd gotten out. And he was repairing weed whackers and mowing machines and that sort of thing. And he was so happy, so calm, so right with the world. All of us are not going to end up like Sean Hopwood cooking for Janice Rogers Brown. But all of us can repair, well, all of us can try. I can't repair a weed whacker, but all of us can aspire to do something productive.
How did you leave it as you left the shop there, Judge Cup?
I said, you better fix that damn weed whacker.
So that's an incredibly long thing to play. But in particular, there's a moment where, and this was a very unusual relationship. This wasn't a teacher, student, parent, kid, mentor, kid. This was in a criminal justice setting. But when he was being sentenced, Sean said, I think I can turn this around. I think I can shift this. And the judge, who now says his instincts sucked, didn't believe him, didn't see that in him. And obviously, everything we're trying to do is to reach kids long before they're sitting in front of a federal judge for having been a bank robber and doing the other things. But if you imagine that there had been someone helping Sean connect the dots between his current self as a teenager and what clearly is a pretty extraordinary possible self, it might have actually, in a very limited amount of time, fundamentally changed that whole trajectory from what it took him 13 years in federal prison to share. So the kind of example of the kind of gap that developmental relationships can shift. So what I also said I would do is give you a quick sense of the fact that the good news is that we actually can do something about this. And the examples I'm going to give you are from a couple of recent research studies. But again, everything we're doing at Search Institute says you don't need to have a PhD and be doing some kind of carefully controlled process to do this with kids. It can happen through the everyday interaction in your context. So, but I chose this psychology experiment because I think it's pretty cool because it uses virtual reality. So for any of you who saw the movie Avatar, you know that we're increasingly living in a world in which you can accurately represent people by a computer animated image that reflects the movements and voices of a real person. And so in this experiment, which happened at Stanford University a couple years ago, they used virtual reality. They put a virtual reality helmet on all of the participants who were college students or approximately college-age kids. This would be a tough thing to probably replicate in your programs and schools because each of those helmets costs about $50,000. But what it allows you to do is take the way a person actually looks, and this is one of the participants in the study, that's their real face, and generate first a fairly accurate computer representation of their face. And this is not really expensive Hollywood imagery. They do a quick scan and you can generate this. But the really important part of this experiment is they didn't just generate a computer avatar of how the person looked today. They also generated one of how that person might look at 70. So these are the two avatars of this actual face. And here's what they did in the experiment. They had people randomly assigned to two groups, like almost all of these experiments do. One that was going to get the treatment, the test, and one that was going to be a control to see if something changed when we do this. So group A went into a computer lab where they were looking at a screen. The rest of the room was pretty plain. They put on the virtual reality helmet, and they saw their avatar at their age. And when they moved, the avatar moved. And when they talked, the avatar talked. And it was their current self. Another computer avatar came in, controlled by somebody who was not physically in the room. And that person asked them a series of basic questions. Who are you? What do you do? What kinds of things do you like? And this went on for about 10 minutes, long enough for the person to actually begin to relate to their avatar. That's really me. And they responded to these questions, and then they left the lab. They were done. Group B came in, and everything else was identical. But instead of seeing their 20-year-old self, they saw their 70-year-old self. When they moved, the 70-year-old self moved. When they talked, the 70-year-old self talked. And the other computer avatar asked the exact same question, same protocol. Finished the computer part of the simulation, that person leaves the room. After they left the room, they were told that unexpectedly they'd been given $1,000. And they had to allocate that $1,000 among 4 different tasks. Buy something nice for someone special, invest it in retirement, plan a fun, an extravagant occasion, or put it in a checking account. What they found was after that 10-minute computer simulation, the people who saw themselves at 70 spent twice as much money saving for retirement as the people who saw themselves at 20. And then when they redid the experiment later, and they not only made the person who was 70 older, but older and happy, they further increased it yet again. And the theory, which is pretty obvious there, is that they immediately convinced that person, oh my God, I will be 70 someday. That will be me. And saving money now is not deferring happiness in the present. It's extending my happiness in the future. It's investing in my future. And it wasn't that they read them a bunch of information about how poorly a lot of people are saving for retirement in our economy, which is true, or how much better their retirement will be if they have money for it. They didn't talk about retirement at all. They merely made a personal connection between the current self and the future self. And that had implications for behavior in the present. Now, if you don't happen to have one of those $50,000 helmets or something like that, there's other research that does very similar things with what's called a possible self tree. Sometimes other researchers have done life plans. And the basic idea here is that you're asking kids first, in the roots, you're listing your strengths. So this kid, I got this from a school in North Carolina. This kid said, I like to play football. I like to sleep all day. I can walk with others. I like to play cards. So pretty interesting. I'm good at math. Listing of those things. And then you go forward and you give the kid the branches. You say, the branches are going to be hopes and dreams, expectations, the branches where they're going forward. And the kid is expressing their wishes and hopes on the leaves. Now, you notice in Stevens, he says one of his hopes and dreams is to get out of this class, actually. But on the other side, it says, to have a house, to be a boss. And these can be very, very different things. Now, the key to this is that you don't just do this one time and say good luck. Then you actually turn the dialogue into an ongoing conversation about, OK, how well are you connecting your current strengths, building on assets, to where you want to be in the future? And it's making that connection explicit that can be powerful. Another way to do this that also works with kids is if you help young people develop that vision of the possible self through conversation, through dialogue, then you actually have them write a letter to their current self telling them what strengths you need to build on today to be me, and what issues you need to address, what you need to stop doing. And psychological experiments, again, have found that this can have really profound and transformative impact on how kids will interact in school and work. You usually, if the content is appropriate, you want kids to share that. They're sharing it with you, and hopefully they're sharing it with others, so it's public. But some simple ways to rewire that disconnect between the current self and the future self. There was one other example that I thought I would use that, for me, seems to capture this. And this is, again, not from a kid, but going kind of viral on Facebook the last week. Some of you have probably seen this. There's a blog by a guy who writes about the fact that his new marriage was going very, very badly. And I've had this forwarded 5 times to me by different people. Not because they know something about my marriage. One of my wife's friends posted it, now that I think about it, actually. But something had happened in his marriage, and he posted this blog that's gotten 50 million hits or something like that. But I thought I would quickly give this snippet today, because I think his recounting of what his father told him is one of those great examples of that Adrian Peterson rushing through the whole moment. That because that relationship existed, there was the potential to provide challenge and support at that critical moment that connected the current self to the future self, for this guy who apparently has been fighting depression and had tried suicide at one point in his life, but who is a successful writer in his 20s. So he said, perhaps each of us have moments in our lives when it feels like time slows down or the air becomes still and everything around us seems to draw in, marking that moment as one we will never forget. My dad giving his response to my concerns was such a moment for me. With a knowing smile, he said, Seth, you're being totally selfish, so I'm going to make this really simple. Marriage isn't for you. You don't marry to make yourself happy. You marry to make someone else happy. More than that, your marriage isn't for yourself. You're marrying for a family, not just for the in-laws and all of that nonsense, but for your future children. Who do you want to help you raise them? Who do you want to influence them? Marriage isn't for you. It's not about you. Marriage is about the person you marry. It was in that very moment that I knew that Kim was the right person to marry. I realized that I wanted to make her happy, to see her smile every day, to make her laugh every day. I wanted to be a part of her family, and my family wanted her to be a part of ours. And thinking back on all the times I'd seen her play with my nieces, I knew that she was the one with whom I wanted to build our own family. My father's advice was both shocking and revelatory. It went against the grain of today's Walmart philosophy, which is if it doesn't make you happy, you can take it back and get a new one. For that 20-year-old, that moment where his father essentially said, marriage is not for you, it's for someone else, had immediate implications for his actions in the present. But if you look at it, what was essential was the vision of the future. A vision of a future with his kids, with a different kind of relationship. So connecting that dot, not just for kids, for ourselves. So if you left here after the conference and walked in on Monday and said, oh, great, there was this guy from Search Institute, he said we should try and have developmental relationships, let's form one. Your chances of success would probably not be really high. These things have to happen pretty authentically. But I think just as we are increasingly, at least within schools, not trying to leave who gets a good teacher or who gets a high-quality curriculum to chance, the basic premise of our new work on developmental relationships at Search is that we also shouldn't leave having developmental relationships to chance. And some kids have them, some kids don't. Some points in their lives they have them, some points they don't. So we want to go beyond just studying what developmental relationships are and why they are good things, because it's sort of like showing you a great painting. I could tell you why it's great and how hard it was to do, but if I don't show you how to actually paint it, I'm kind of only doing half of the task. So also a priority for us at Search Institute is going to be designing ways that people working directly with kids can build developmental relationships. And our basic idea here is that just as developmental relationships help kids develop those life skills, if we focus with kids on developing life skills, it'll be a great way to build developmental relationships. So our first process that we're working on is going to be called the Perseverance Process. We'll be piloting around the country and communities in 2014 and 15, and we hope to have it widely available by 2016. Leslie and I were talking on the way over about some possibilities of doing some of that work here. There's going to be 5 phases to it. I'm not going to go over these in detail. Some of these are ones that you've already heard about. But the first will be sharing sparks. In many places where I go around the country, they've never heard of the idea of a spark. But you here again are, many of you, way ahead of that, knowing that a spark is that inherent interest, passion that lights up a kid's life, or the cause, like their family, their community, the environment, whatever, that motivates them, helping kids understand. A key part of the perseverance process for building developmental relationships, though, is not only do we have to make the kids' spark explicit, they need to know your spark. They need to understand what animates you. And hopefully, they get the sense that part of your spark is being with them. So one of the things we're thinking about as part of the perseverance process is, we are constantly having science fairs with kids or history days. Let's have a Sparks Fair. But again, the adults are participating in the Sparks Fair as well. So the first phase is establishing that understanding of sparks. The second phase will be connecting current self to future self. And we're going by the phrase, think forward, act now, as the core thing we want kids to be doing. Projecting into the future, but connecting that to current action today. The third phase we talked about last night that I'm not going to go into today on this visit is there's a growing body of research that shows that actually if we teach kids that their level of intelligence is not static, that actually you can get smarter with effort, that the brain is like a muscle. Just like when you work out your biceps, they'll be broken down and get bigger. When you challenge yourself intellectually, you create new neural connections in the brain and get smarter. It has very positive implications for kids' motivation, persistence, and even their actual learning. So the third phase of the perseverance process will be helping kids understand that you actually can increase intelligence and, more generally, your capacity and ability with effort. Kids who don't have that view don't think it makes sense to invest and keep trying because no matter what I do, I can't get better. The fourth phase will be, and this will be building a lot on the developmental assets research, creating a support card. By support card, we mean a companion to the report cards that kids get all the way through school. I mean, by my count, back of the envelope, American teachers this year will issue more than 100 million report cards telling kids how well they did meeting our expectations for them in school. The support card will be saying, OK, when do we actually see how supported kids feel, not just in school, but in their lives more broadly, in meeting those expectations. And then the final phase will be a structured goal management process that is designed to help kids keep moving through obstacles. Again, there's a lot of interesting research coming from the behavioral sciences that never makes it into schools and youth programs that shows that if we actually teach kids to focus not just on the benefits of achieving a goal, which some kids do, and not just on the obstacles to achieving a goal, which a lot of kids do also, but the benefits and the obstacles together, and then we practice if-then statements. If I hit the obstacle, then I will. You can get kids who usually are like a deer in the headlights, or I'm just going to quit when the obstacles hit, into solution mode. That actually they will apply that mental practice to dealing with the obstacle that hits when you're not with them, and the moment that they have to make that decision. So you can see this process will go by the acronym STICK, as in stick to it. And we're hoping it's not a program, but like the developmental assets have been for 20 years, it's a framework that people can apply in their local settings. One person, when I was in Chicago last week, I mentioned, and we went through this in greater detail. It wasn't just me talking at them. We had dialogues. They said, oh my God, how could you get all that done? So for you, I thought I'd add one of my favorite quotes. Is from the conductor and composer Leonard Bernstein. To achieve great things, two things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time. So the next time you feel like that I can't do all this, you're on the verge of greatness, actually. So OK, what if you don't want to wait for this perseverance process, or you don't want to wait till we figure out all these developmental relationships things? I wanted to give you a few takeaways for like what could you possibly do right now. And these are pretty common sense. First thing is, I think, to start doing some learning about these life skills and developmental relationships. And I'm going to give you 3 recommendations, well, really 2 recommendations for books that you could read in a moment. There's also a lot of other ways to think about it. But to first of all begin thinking about developmental relationships and life skills intentionally and explicitly, and maybe together, in fact. The second thing is, and I've just been part of a national task force focused on these life skills, and a lot of people are trying to solve them, as I said at the beginning, through programs rather than relationships. And I'll tell you, it's an important discussion because we got to figure out this stuff. It is so easy to get lost in the maze of, well, should we focus on perseverance or motivation or empathy or collaboration or emotional intelligence or what? To some extent, my answer would be just pick one. Just get started. And like the developmental assets, in picking one, you're not saying the others are not important, but you're saying, darn it, we have to start somewhere. So let's start watching for this one in our kids. The one I find to be really useful is perseverance, stick-to-itiveness, because it's relevant to almost everything we do, whether you're coaching kids on a team or teaching math or dealing with a kid who's on your caseload for some reason. But there's others that you absolutely could do as well. Find a way to measure. There are surveys that are valid and reliable measures of things like perseverance and hope. Search Institute offers some of them. There are others that other organizations offer. But don't just measure quantitatively, measure these life skills, or measure kids' experience of relationships. Also talk to kids. Youth voice and youth leadership will give you a lot more information. And we were talking last night about some of the youth presentations that you're going to have as part of this conference. It's one of the things that makes me wish I could be here the whole time. You're going to listen for this stuff. When those kids are talking to you, listen for developmental relationships, and the life skills that they help kids develop. And then start building through those two things that we've talked about today: nudges in your organization and developmental relationships in your one-to-one interaction with kids. How can we create nudges in our relationship that give kids a limited number of choices, no bad choices, and the default choice, if they don't choose otherwise, is a good choice, but the kid feels that I made a choice? And then how do we build those developmental relationships that are a mix of challenge and support? And then stick to it. Go back and measure again and learn some more. So I mentioned a couple of resources if you are really a glutton for punishment and you want to read more about these. Actually, it is 3 books I decided last night to give it, because people, it's your fault that you got so many slides, because last night everybody was writing so intently. So I said, well, and so for some reason in this community, people really like this wonky stuff, so that's great. Nudge is an interesting book to read if you're interested in the organizational aspect, how you design your classroom, your school, your community. And those two scholars and others are doing a lot of interesting work. They both have websites, and now there's other studies who are trying to think about nudges. I'll tell you, I mean, I'm from Minnesota. We're the home of Target Corporation. Target applies more PhD-level cutting-edge research on developmental psychology to the product placement on a shelf than most of us do working with kids in high-stakes, high-impact settings, because we don't have access to it. They're running high-level experiments to see which product should go on which shelf in which order. And it has, you know, big, big benefits for their bottom line. So one of the things that you can do with stuff like Nudge is that's also an effort to take all of that research on human motivation and put it in a simple idea you can use. So Nudge would be one example. Second would be a book called Mindset by a researcher named Carol Dweck. She's one of the leading people in thinking about intelligence and effort. And this book is written for non-researchers. So there's a lot of stories in it. There's a lot of examples of how you think about fulfillment of potential, especially motivation and perseverance. And then finally, there's another book that was written by a New York Times reporter, a guy named Paul Tough. And it came out last year. And he was going around the country, and he kept going to visit these beat-the-odds schools. And he would come away, you know, that are producing all these outcomes with kids living in poverty and facing other challenges. And he would come away, and every time he would say, when he compared those schools to the quote-unquote regular schools, he would say, gee, it didn't seem like the curriculum was that much better. It didn't seem like the teachers were that much more knowledgeable about mathematics. It didn't seem like the structure of the school, either physically or their schedule, was that different. There were differences that were important. What he came away with, and you can see the subtitle, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character. And so that book does a nice job of painting a picture of how research is telling us more and more about how important those soft skills are, those life skills. So Nudge, Mindset, How Children Succeed. And I thought I'd end as I did last night, because people, again, they didn't laugh, with a children's book that dates back from the 1930s. Probably some of you remember reading it, The Velveteen Rabbit. And there's a passage in it that I think captures really nicely what is at the core of this task for all of us who are working with kids. As some of you will remember, it's a story in which the rabbit, the toy rabbit, ultimately wants to become real, wants to become not just a toy rabbit. And the book details his efforts to do that. And near the end, he's talking with the toy horse, who is much older and who has lived a life in which the horse tells the kid he became real and how you become real. So I thought I would end with that passage, because even if you forget all the charts and graphs and all the stuff about psychology and experiments that we've talked about this morning, if you can think about how, for Sean Hopwood, the guy who spent 13 years in prison before he really found himself, ultimately these things happen through the tough rubbing of people up against each other in life in relationships. So here's that passage from Velveteen Rabbit. Real isn't how you are made, said the skin horse. It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you. Then you become real. Does it hurt? Asked the rabbit. Sometimes, said the skin horse, for he was always thoughtful. When you're real, you don't mind becoming hurt. Does it happen all at once, like being wound up, he asked, or bit by bit? It doesn't happen all at once, said the skin horse. You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily, or have sharp edges, or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you're real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you're real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. I suppose you're real, said the rabbit, and then he wished he had not said it, for he thought the skin horse might be sensitive. But the skin horse only smiled. The boy's uncle made me real, he said. That was a great many years ago. But once you're real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always. So I think that here, the work that you're doing in Georgetown, and that I know you'll be talking about for the rest of the conference, ultimately is about helping kids become real. And that while we have to do all the heavy lifting with our programs, with our measurement, with the things that you have such a head start on here, in the end, it comes down to those relationships as the best and most lasting way to help kids become real. So thank you for the opportunity to walk you through this whirlwind. I really apologize for needing to head out now. And as we were chatting, I'm assuming that you also will forgive me for breaking us a little bit early, both so that I can break this down and you can have a slightly longer break. So thank you very much again. I really appreciate it.
Before you rush
Oh my
out,
gosh,
we have
thank
a
you.
parting gift for you. So it's a framed copy of the binder cover.
Oh, that's great.
Which is what our kids designed this year. So we really thank you for being here both last night and today, and love the new direction that you're headed in. And if any of us in the community can be a part of that, we'd love to. So safe travels to you.
Thank you so
very
much. And they have a version of the PowerPoint if you want it for your purposes, for any of it. You can get it from folks here, I'm sure, and feel free to use it for whatever purposes you have. So
Thank you.
thank you. This is great.